It's great to be with you, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I so appreciate Pastor Dennis and Marilyn and their wonderful family, and you're blessed to have them right here in Sheridan, Iowa. So join me in thanking the Lord for such great pastors. And I'm sure you saw the lights out there. I don't know what the situation was, but let's say a prayer for whoever's involved in that accident. And Heavenly Father, we pray for whoever was involved in that accident. It seems serious with all the ambulances. And have mercy on them. Let your healing power flow into their bodies. Lord, bless them and their family. And send your angels to bring your power and your love and your healing to them. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, tonight I'm going to talk about a book called Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present. And I also thought I did a presentation and they were interested in this, so I'll throw this in. We have a lot of election type irregularities going on. Well, did you know in 1948 Lyndon Baines Johnson was running for the Democrat primary for the U.S. Senate in Texas against the Democrat Governor Coke Stevenson. And Coke Stevenson was more popular than LBJ, but there were notorious ballot irregularities to steal the election. So on election night, it looked like Coke Stevenson won, but mysteriously a box with uncounted ballots was discovered in the South Texas town of Alice in Jim Wells County, precinct number 13, which happens to have been Lyndon Johnson's precinct. And confusion reigned in Texas, and by the end of the week, LBJ won by 87 votes. And the FBI, Postal Department, and other agencies began investigating and piecing it together. The story emerged that during the tabulation of these newly found ballots, LBJ's campaign manager, John B. Connolly, goes to Alice, Texas, to Jim Wells County to help out. And the head of the county is George Parr, the Duke of Duval. He's the political boss. And anyway, he allows John Connolly to have access to the ballots that were being counted as the returns were amended. Later, George Parr committed suicide. But when the dust settles, the newly recounted ballots showed 202 extra votes. And some of them were deceased and buried in the local cemetery, and others were gone on election day. And these extra voters had lined up in alphabetical order. At the last minute, they signed in with the same blue ink in the same handwriting, and they all cast their ballots for LBJ. Anyway, and so the New York Times did a story on it, and the article goes on where Johnson, this guy says, it was stolen for him, and I knew exactly how it was done. And this 76-year-old white-haired George P. Barr, South Texas, this is New York Times, political leader. Mr. Salas served for a decade, and before John killed himself, and LBJ's dead. So this guy decides to break his silence because he wants peace of mind. And he says, I was just going along with my party. Mr. Parr, ordered that 200 odd votes be added to Mr. Johnson's total for box 13. And there's the title of the article. Ex-official says, and so Mr. Salas said he had seen the fraudulent votes, added them in alphabetical order, and had them certified as authentic on order from Mr. Parr. Parr was the godfather. He could tell any election judge, give us 80% of the vote and the other guy 20%, and we had it made in every election. So then they got the Associated Press interviewed a former FBI agent, T. Kellis Bridwell, and he said, also, the last 202 names were made with the same colored ink and the same handwriting, whereas the earlier names in the poll list were written by different individuals in different colored inks. The final statewide count, including the box 13, gave Mr. Johnson an 87 vote margin, earning him the tongue-in-cheek nickname Landslide Lyndon. It wasn't a landslide, but anyway. So the Democrat Central Committee is deadlocked, 28 to 28 on whether to certify it. They get some businessmen to come back from another state to cast his vote in the Democrat Central Committee for LBJ. And then it gets brought to the Supreme Court. And LBJ turned to a attorney and FDR appointee Abe Fortas, and he intercedes for the Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black. You know him because he did the separation of church and state decision. And so Hugo Black decides that the Supreme Court will not intervene. He'll leave it to the states to decide. And anyway, the state decided in LBJ's favor. And when LBJ gets to be president, he appoints Abe Fortas to the Supreme Court. And then Abe Fortas takes a bribe from Wall Street, and he's forced to resign from the Supreme Court. And so Washington Post article, How Landslide Lyndon Earned His Name. This is an article by David Brugger, and he said, the slimy creature who stole the 1948 Texas Senate election, Lyndon Johnson, driven by boundless ambition, and his career had been a story of manipulation, deceit, and ruthlessness. The morality of the ballot box, in which nothing matters but the victory, and any maneuver that leads to victory is justified. He said Johnson stole the victory in the 1948 Senate race. That campaign was an American classic. Johnson continued to that way. The 87 vote victory had earned him the derisive nickname Landslide Lyndon. Even in March of 2006, Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott posted a column on the state attorney general's website stating, vote fraud is no newcomer to the Lone Star State. 6 decades ago, the votes found in Jim Wells County infamous ballot box 13 helped Lyndon Johnson squeak into the U.S. Senate in that 1948 primary. So here we have, some 60, 70 years ago, ballots being found after the polls closed and all kinds of shenanigans. So anyway, there's more there, but I thought you would find that interesting. So I sent out a daily email called American Minute, and socialism. All research of socialism goes back to Plato. He lived in Greece, 380 BC. And in passing, Plato writes of the island of Atlantis, this highly structured, advanced civilization that gets swallowed up with a tsunami earthquake and sinks to the bottom of the ocean. Now, whether it existed or not is legendary. Something it could have been the island of Santorini, which is this Greek island that was a volcano that blew up, and all that's left is the rim. And the Greek built this cute little white village that streams along the rim of this. I went to it one time when I was over there in Greece, but you had a lot of tourist attractions because everything in the whole little, village is white with blue. It's really pretty. But anyway, it used to be an island that blew up, something that could have been Atlantis. Who knows? Nobody for sure. But Plato thought Atlantis existed, and he thought that it was the perfect structured society. And Plato considered democracy an unstructured society. Demos means people, crassy means rule, and so Athens had a democracy, and Plato considered it unstructured. He says the main characteristic of a democracy is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. It's wonderful. He says it's charming. He says the state is like a bazaar at which you can buy anything, like a piece of embroidery, of which the colors and figures of the manners of men, there will be the greatest variety of human natures. Such is democracy, a pleasing, lawless, various sort of government, a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder, and dispensing a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike. So Plato says in his Republic, he says the manner of life is that of democrats. Now he's talking about a democracy, so that's why he uses that term. Manner of life is that of democrats. Every man does what's right in their own eyes. So, chief characteristic of a democracy is tolerance. So they tolerate everybody, it's great. Then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. Then they tolerate people that are a lot off. So finally they're tolerating crooks and crime and fraud and all kinds of immorality, and people just go along with it. And he says the father gets accustomed to descending to the level of his son and to fear him, and the son having no shame or fear of his parents. The teacher fears and flatters his students. The students despise their masters and tutors. Citizens vote, and then it's a democracy, so they can vote. So the citizens vote to take the money from the rich people, right? And they take the money out of the treasury. And then there's not enough money to go around, and he says the leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them amongst the people. at the same time taking care to reserve for the larger part for themselves. Democracy's insatiable desire brings her to disillusion. So they tolerate people that are off, and they tolerate people that are a lot off, and then he says the young man passes into freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime not accepting incest or any other unnatural union. Yes, that's what he's talking about. He's parted company with all shame. So now we have sexual casting off of restraints. And now an interesting study was done by anthropologist J.D. Unwin. And he's from Oxford. He writes a book in 1934 called Sex and Culture. And he studied not just Athens, but 80 civilizations over 5,000 years. And he concluded in his 1934 book that the loosening of sexual restraints always leads to civilizational decline. And he says that a civilization goes through 4 stages. The first is pain and poverty. So first they have a war or a famine. And then they come out of it and they work hard and they get productive. And then they become protective and patriotic, and they begin to expand and become innovative and creative, and finally they get prosperous. And then they start enjoying their pleasure of their prosperity, and then they become promiscuous and indulgent, undisciplined, lawless, and wicked, and then they get conquered by the next civilization that comes along. So civilizations are sort of like athletes, and when they're young, they're focused, disciplined, productive, they exercise, watch their diet, and they want to get that prize, be the champ. And finally, they get to be the champ. And then they rule and reign for a short time, and then they get a little bit lazy, and they don't exercise as much, and they eat a little bit more than they should. And before they look, they're a couch potato. And in their mind, they still think they're the tough guy. And the next civilization that's rising up gets in the ring and beats the tar out of them, and then they get conquered. And so this is a very interesting study that sexual promiscuity always precedes the decline of the civilization. In his book, Sex and Culture, J.D. Unwin even calls it a sexual marketplace. He says if the women say nothing happens unless there's a ring and a commitment, the guys will say, okay, whatever it takes. and then kids appear. And then the guy ends up becoming protective of his wife and family, and then productive to want to bring something back to feed them, right? And when all the men in the country are doing this, the whole country becomes protective and productive. And rising water floats all boats, right? But if the women say, well, there doesn't need to be a commitment, and the water seeks its own level, you have a bunch of guys saying, oh, fine, and they become pleasure-focused and selfish and indulgent, and there's fewer kids to fill the ranks of the army. And when all the men in the country act this way, the whole country becomes weakened, and then they get conquered by the next civilization. So it's interesting that what Plato said would happen, that they would tolerate people that were a little bit off, then they would tolerate people that are a lot off, till finally they're tolerating immorality and all kinds of crime. And John Adams said, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue, and without virtue there could be no political liberty? Will you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy, intoxication, extravagance, vice, and folly? No effort in favor of virtue is lost. Harry Truman said, without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates quickly into selfishness and anarchy. So Plato said that democracy is great, they tolerate each other, then they tolerate people that are a little bit off, and they tolerate people that are a lot off, till finally they're tolerating immorality and crime and looting and robbing and stealing and smashing windows and lawlessness in the streets, and it becomes unstructured. And then the people begin to say, can't someone come along and fix this mess? And that's when some governor comes along and says, I can fix it, I just need some emergency powers. And first, the governor is a protector. And it says, last of all comes the tyrant. When he first appears above ground, he is a protector. He's full of smiles. And so he begins to consolidate power. And then, if any are suspected of resistance to his authority, he will have a good pretext for destroying them. The protector is finally standing up in the chariot of state with the reins of power in his hand. He's revealed as a tyrant absolute. And then, having a mob entirely at his disposal, he's not restrained from shedding of blood. So he stirs up the mob to go after his political opponents. So Plato says that democracy is doomed to fail because it's based on the people being virtuous. Right? The people are in charge, and the people are, but people really don't have virtue. He says if you give them a choice of giving up their life or giving up the virtue, they'll always give up the virtue to save their life. So it's just a matter of time till this democracy experiment crashes. And like a satellite being pulled back down to earth. Now, I'll tell you in a minute about ancient Israel's first 400 years out of Egypt. Before they got King Saul, they had a form of government called the Hebrew Republic, and theirs lasted a little bit longer because they had a big magnet in the sky called God. Everyone was virtuous because they were accountable to God. Athens did not have that. Athens, by Plato's time, had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in anyway. And so Plato said it's just a matter of time till this democracy crashes. And he says this, if a truly just man lived, let him die as he lived. I might add that the just man will be scourged and racked and bound and will at last be crucified. Here's Plato saying, people really aren't virtuous. He said, if a virtuous just man was ever born, the world would crucify him. Imagine that, he says that in 380 BC. And so Plato says that the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. And he is the philosopher king, he's the head of gold, and his administrator military are the arms and chest of silver. They're the deep state political cronies surrounding the governor, right? And together they make up the ruling class. And everyone else is the abdomen of iron and bronze. They are the ruled class. So socialism is a socially structured society of a ruling class and a ruled class. And the ruling class, they're above the law. They're politically connected. They're supported by the commoner class, and they can do things like getting their hair styled when nobody else can. Right? And the ruled class, they own no property. They have no families. This is Plato. The government decides who gets to have children, and the government takes the children away from the parents. And these kids are brought in to the city and indoctrinated with noble lives. They're socialized, which means that they learn how to give up their values and just learn to serve the state, serve the ruling class. So Plato explained that this tyrant will institute a structured society. So we go from the structured Atlantis to the unstructured democracy, but he says, no, this guy will put back in place a structure. And he says, when the true philosopher kings are born in a state, they will set in order their own city. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. And these kids will be taught noble lies. It says, we want one single grand lie which will be believed by everybody. Could you imagine taking the kids away from the parents and putting them in a school where they're taught lies? And anyway, so that's Plato. That's the beginning of the very thought of socialism, a structured society of a ruling class and a ruled class. Well, that was 380 BC. Now let's fast forward a couple thousand years, and you got Columbus discovering America, and a few years later, Sir Thomas More in England writes The Island of Utopia. Now, he writes it as a veiled jab at King Henry VIII, who wants to control everybody's life. But the word utopia means nowhere, and it was a fictitious island discovered off the coast of South America by Amerigo Vespucci in his book, Island of Utopia. And it's written as a Greek dialogue, like a conversation. So you read Plato, Plato's just recording dialogues between Socrates and some other stranger. So you're listening in on this dialogue. And so this book is a dialogue with a traveler. The traveler's name is Hythlodaeus, which means peddler of nonsense. So here's utopia, which means nowhere, peddler of nonsense. And lo and behold, on Utopia, it's a perfectly structured society. And it's an island like Atlantis. There's upper class rulers and the lower class commoners. There's free healthcare. There's free identical clothing. Everyone receives free welfare. There's common meals in a monastic communal type dining hall. Everyone lives in identical 3-story public housing. There are no locks on any doors. There's no private property. All property, all goods are stored in a communal warehouse. There are no taverns, no ale houses, no coffee houses. There's no places for private gatherings. There's no privacy. Everyone is tracked everywhere they go with an internal passport. The government decides everyone's careers. And there are no families on this utopia. Again, the childbearing is regulated by the government. And the government takes the kids away. And so this is like China's one-child policy. Or, believe it or not, Planned Parenthood's Margaret Sanger said, no woman shall have a legal right to bear a child without a permit. And so, we have we're studying socialism. It goes back to Plato's Island of Atlantis, goes back to Sir Thomas More Island of Utopia. And those both inspired Sir Francis Bacon, who wrote New Atlantis. So he names his book New Atlantis, referring back to Plato's Atlantis. And this is a fictitious island discovered in the South Pacific. Now, Sir Francis Bacon lives at the time of Queen Elizabeth, William Shakespeare, Francis Bacon in the scientific revolution period. And this New Atlantis is, again, a highly structured society with the ruling class and ruled class, and the government dictates everyone's careers. And someone wrote a satire on it, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Right, here's Gulliver washed up on the island of Lilliput, right? And he finds, oh, it's a highly structured society on this island with a ruling class that's ridiculous, and then the ruled class, that they have to do everything they're told, and the government decides all their careers and everything. Now, why is this important? The Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were originally a company colony. What's that? That means that you have a bunch of rich people that pitch in money to pay for their boat ride and underwrite their colony. And so this company colony had investors that wrote the bylaws being modeled after Plato, Sir Thomas More, Sir Francis Bacon. And the Pilgrims had everything owned in common, and they nearly starved to death. And so this is the Pilgrim bylaws. All profits, benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or any other means shall remain in ye common stock. And all are to have their meat, drink, and apparel, and all provisions out of ye common stock. And Governor of the Pilgrims, William Bradford, says the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of later times. I just think this is amazing. Here in the Pilgrim Governor's book, he knew that they were trying to live out Plato's perfect society. And he mentioned it right in there. Proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato that the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men, who were most able and fit for service, objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc. than the weak man who was not able to do a quarter that the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men, who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc. with the humbler and younger, was thought at some indignity and disrespect to them. As for men's wives, who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it or allow it. Let none argue that this is due to human failing rather than to this communistic plan of life itself. Here's the Pilgrims. He says, look, we tried this communistic plan of life. I answer that God in his wisdom saw that another plan was fitter for them. So they began to consider how to raise more corn and obtain a better crop than they had done, so they might not continue to endure the misery of want, like starving through a winter. At length, after much debate, the governor, with the chief among them, allowed each man to plant corn for his own household. Wow, what a novel idea. So every family was assigned a parcel of land. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious, so that much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means, and gave far better satisfaction. the women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would have led weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. So here we have Plato's or Thomas More's or Francis Bacon, this theoretical, a bunch of guys sitting around trying to figure out, oh, this would be perfect. The Pilgrims trying to live this thing, and they nearly starve to death. Nobody's motivated to do anything, so they scrap it, and they give everybody their own plot land. And so, now people say, well, the early church, didn't they own everything in common? Well, there's two very important differences: voluntary versus involuntary, and church versus government. The early believers voluntarily sold their land, and they laid the money at the feet of the apostles for the church to distribute. It was not them being involuntarily forced to sell their land and put the money at the feet of Pilate for the Roman government to redistribute. You see, when the church helps the poor, the church has a goal of wanting the poor to get better off. Why? So they can help the next person down the line. Right? And they are grateful and they become thankful for the help, and relationships are developed. And you are grateful to the person that's giving you, and so that the church is demonstrating the love of God, and they want to say, hey, I want to demonstrate it, they replicate it. When the government forcibly takes away your property and your land, you are robbed of being charitable. You can't be charitable with stuff you don't own. So Karl Marx says communism can be summed up. Lenin said socialism is a transition phase from capitalism to communism. So people say socialism is different than communism. No, socialism is the road, communism is the goal, is the destination. Right? So socialism is just a way to get to communism. And Karl Marx says communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. But yet the Bible gives private property. You read through, they come into the promised land, and they draw lots, and each family gets permanent title to their property. And if you own property, you can be moved upon in your heart to give away some of it. That is called being charitable. If you do not own any property, you cannot give anything away, so you are robbed of being charitable. What are you going to do, steal it from somebody else to give it away? And so these are very important differences where people say, well, the early church owned everything in common. They voluntarily decided to sell their land and give it. It wasn't the government taking it. And they gave it to the church and not the government. And so the church historically has started all the hospitals and orphanages and medical clinics and all these different feeding poor people in villages and digging wells in villages and so forth. The church is people voluntarily being motivated to do that. And there is another dynamic. When people receive free stuff from the government, it goes from them being grateful to them viewing it as a debt owed to them. And then another psychological thing happens. After they receive free stuff for a while, they begin to feel bad about themselves. And these negative feelings, they have to channel somewhere, and so they channel these negative feelings toward the very entity that is making them feel bad, the government that's giving them free stuff. So the longer they receive free stuff, they end up hating the very government that's giving them the free stuff. And now, there's confusion as to the role of government. In the Bible, God gives commands to 5 main groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. There are commands for individuals to take care of the poor, visit the sick and those in prison. There's really no commands for the family to take care of the poor strangers. The commands of the family are: husband, love your wives, and children, submit to your parents. There's really no commands for the employers or the employees to take care of the poor. Those commands are put on day's work and don't hold back the wages. There are commands for the church to take care of the poor. Historically, the church has. And like I mentioned, most of the hospitals were started by churches and so forth. There's no command for the government to take care of the poor. The command to the government is the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There's no command for the government to be involved in healthcare. No command for the government to be involved in education. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. And there's a great quote from Calvin Coolidge. He said, "It does not follow that because something ought to be done, the national government ought to do it." We need to take care of the poor. Yes, but it's not the government's job. It's the church's job and the individual's job. But we need to do this, we need to do that. Here's a quote from Gerald Ford. He says, "People say, why don't you expand that program and spend more federal money?" I look at them in the eye and say, do you realize that a government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take from us everything we have? It's like, yeah, so socialism can take over a country two ways. One is they come in with tanks. The other is they get everybody to receive enough free stuff long enough they get dependent, and then they control your life. They're like a gang leader can take over a neighborhood two ways. Come in with guns or give away free drugs and get everybody hooked. Right? So the Pilgrims, they scrap the company model and they replace it with a covenant model. What's that? It's people in agreement with each other, but more than agreement, it's people committed to caring for each other. Why? Because each person is individually accountable to God, and we each get our individual rights from God. Right? So the Pilgrims were part of a movement between the Reformation 1517 and the Age of Enlightenment in the early 1600s. You got a century where the scholars in Europe are not just thrilled they can read the Bible in their own language. They focus on a part of the Bible for that first 400-year period when Israel came out of Egypt before they got King Saul. That period is called the Hebrew Republic, and it's totally unique in world history. One of my books called Who is the King in America? I do an overview of all the world's history. And you have pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers and sultans and czars. The most common form of government is kings. And as the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger because with military advancements, the king can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with a bronze weapon or an iron weapon or a big long phalanx spear the Greeks had, or a scimitar sword that the Muslims had, or gunpowder that the Chinese invented. The weapon changes, but all it does is magnify that same selfish nature. And so these kingdoms keep getting bigger and bigger. And so ancient Israel comes out of Egypt around 1400 BC, and for 400 years, Israel does not have a king. And they're ruled by each citizen being taught the law. And so this was studied so much that they taught Hebrew at Harvard and Yale. They would give commencement addresses in Hebrew. And this is Yale's coat of arms. To this day, they still have Hebrew characters on it. And now, ancient Israel's model was that everyone was taught the law. So if you think of power as a line, one side being total government, the other side being no government. Right? Total government, power concentrates into the hands of a king, a dictator, a pharaoh, a chairman Mao, or whatever. And they rule through fear. The no government side would be anarchy. No government unless each person is taught the law. I was trying to figure a way of thinking of this. It's like everybody downloads a behavioral app on their iPhone. So how many have GPS app, right? It can tell you where to turn 20 yards ahead, make a left turn in real time. Imagine if there was a behavioral app and it would tell you how to act in real time, right? Don't steal that off that table. Don't lose your temper at that person, right? And the Levites were the computer geeks that helped you to download the app. Now, where do I get this? Okay, go to Apple Play, Google Store. You press line upon line, precept upon precept. So everybody downloads their own version of this behavioral app, and they got it memorized in their heart. In ancient Israel. But wait a second. What would motivate you to follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Well, ancient Israel had a key ingredient. There's a God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal something. There's nobody around. There's no police. You know you can get away with it. And then you think, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He is going to hold me accountable in the future. And you think, maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country really truly believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police. Maximum liberty, right? Maximum no police, because everybody has downloaded this app and they all follow this law. Now, God knew that the Israelites would break the law, and rather than them walk around the rest of their life with a guilty conscience, once a year they would have the Day of Atonement, when they would have a sacrifice and they would bring the blood into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle it on the mercy seat, and everyone's sins in the whole country would be forgiven and for the next year. And then they would have the other sacrifice that they would lay, the high priest would actually lay his hands on its head and confess the sins of the country over this animal. And then by the hand of a young man, it would be taken far out into the wilderness and let go so that all the people would understand all of our sins are taken away. And of course, this is foreshadowing Jesus, that he is the true sacrifice. So Ronald Reagan said, without God, there's no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. So when we say it's one nation under God, mentioning God is more than just a nice little acknowledgement. It's the awareness of God and our accountability to him that makes this self-government system work, right? And that's the sun that makes everything grow. That's the battery that makes all the lights turn on, is everybody being aware of God. And now if you get rid of this God, all you have is a bunch of rules that some old men made up. Why follow them? Some will, as long as it's socially acceptable, like Plato says that they'll be virtuous as long as it's the end thing, but then they're going to realize, hey, if there's no God, this life is all there is, and and I can do something to get ahead. Then you got people yielding to their selfish side, and they start robbing and stealing and killing and smashing windows and looting, and it turns into this lawlessness. And then everybody says, we need someone to come along and fix this mess. And in ancient Israel's case, they got King Saul. So toward the end of the Hebrew Republic, before they got King Saul, the priests stopped teaching the law. And here's Eli, the main high priest that's supposed to be teaching the law. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. And then you have a story of a Levite with a graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. The tribe of Dan comes along and takes the graven image and tells this Levite, come along with us and be a priest to our whole tribe. You're reading the story and thinking, what's this Levite priest doing with a graven image? Isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them. And then the terrible story of a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with a woman he's not even married to. So he's not following the law. They're in a house surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that always appears at the end of a people ruling themselves, right? So in Plato's case, right, the young man gives into libertinism, the useless and unnecessary pleasures, and so here we have ancient Israel, and you have sodomites banging on the door, and the poor girl gets raped and dies, and by the time you're grossed out to read this story, this line, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Isn't that what Plato wrote? The manner of life is that of Democrats. Every man does what is right in their own eyes. It turns into lawlessness. And it's an unstructured chaos. And so Plato says this, and in Israel's case, they all go to Samuel the prophet, and they say, this self-government system's not working anymore. We want to be like all the other countries. We want a king. And Samuel cries, and the Lord tells Samuel, they did not reject me, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Right? And so they get King Saul. A very important story. Saul is pouting that his son Jonathan became friends with David. And he turns to his soldiers and he says, none of you soldiers care about me. And one, Doeg the Edomite, says, King, I care. I saw David go to this town and the priests there gave him some bread and the sword of Goliath that was stored there. And Saul says, bring those priests to me. They come. He turns to his soldiers and says, kill them. The soldiers hesitate. And Doeg the Edomite says, I'll kill him. He goes out there and kills them all. What just happened? The soldiers have been operating under the old system where each individual is accountable to God to follow the law. And the law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn someone to death. There's only one witness, Doeg. So these soldiers are hesitating. Right? You're telling me to kill them, and I'm personally accountable to God, and the law says you need 2 witnesses, there's only one. They're like, this does not compute. Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. You tell me to kill the baby in the womb, I'll kill. You tell me there's no more male and female, fine. Whatever. You tell me there's sex is fluid, tell me you can go to any God. But whatever you say, government, king, I'll surrender my values to you. The king always wants to insert himself between you and God. And anyway. So we're going through the history. Now we're coming up a little bit more to the modern times, and we'll see another very significant installment in the development of socialism. It's called the French Revolution. And France helped America gain independence. You know what they got in return for helping us? Nothing but debt, lots of it. And then their crops failed, and they blamed the king, and they said, if we can only just chop off the king and queen's heads, all of our problems will be solved. Well, they chop them off, and it doesn't get any better. And then it begins to devolve into an unstructured mob in Paris. And they chop off the heads of the royalty. Doesn't get any better. Chop off the heads of the wealthy. You have money, and we don't. You're selfish. Doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the businessmen and farmers. You have food and supplies. We don't. You're selfish. Doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the hoarders, people that have extra food. You have extra. I don't have enough. And then they chop off the heads of the clergy, because they're speaking out against all the head chopping off stuff. And then they chop off the heads of the former revolutionaries, the ones that used to chop off heads but got tired of it, somehow they're blamed. And 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris, France. And their motto of this French Revolution was liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Fraternity was their word for socialism. It's a fraternity, it's a group, it's a collective, it's a socialist state. And equality can be understood two ways. In America, equality was equal treatment before the law, equal opportunity. In France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff. And if the fraternité thinks you have too much stuff, it can take away your stuff and kill you. And so Timothy Dwight was the president of Yale, and during this French Revolution time, he writes this. He goes, about the year 1728, where we had a Great Awakening revival before our revolution, they had Voltaire. Voltaire, so celebrated for his wit and his hatred of Christianity, formed a systematical design to destroy Christianity and to introduce in its stead a general diffusion of irreligion and atheism. The being of God was denied and ridiculed. Possession of property was pronounced robbery. Right? You got property here, and chastity, natural affection, were declared to be nothing more than groundless prejudices. Right? So views on sexual, just adultery, assassination, poisonings, and other crimes of like infernal nature were taught as lawful, provided the end was good. And the education of youth, we're back to what's the kids being taught. Books replete with infidelity, irreligion, immorality, and obscenity. To destroy us, therefore, our enemies must first destroy our Sabbath and seduce us from the house of God, or prohibit us from having church. And so I mentioned this morning. France also did this deconstruction. It's where you tear down the past history, and then people don't remember it, and then you portray your socialist future positively. And it's a sales technique. So if I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is tell you negative things about the toothpaste you're currently using. It's going to eat the enamel off your teeth, and you're like, ooh, and you're repulsed by it. Now I have you in a neutral, you're open-minded, what are all the toothpaste out there? Then I give you my pitch for this brand new Tartar Control breath freshener toothpaste. So that's what they do. They go into the classrooms and they tell kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from Indians, sold people into slavery, and the students are repulsed by it. Now you got the kids into a neutral, they're open-minded, then you give them your pitch for socialism or LGBT or Islam. And Europe went through this. It went from a Judeo-Christian Europe with Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, and Jewish neighborhoods to a secular Europe with the French Revolution, right? Pushing the immorality and the free sex and LGBT turns into, and now it's turning into a socialist Sharia Europe with Muhammad being the #1 name for newborns and the government deciding everyone's careers, right? If you're a kid in Germany, you take tests, and if you don't score good on some tests, the government channels you into different education career paths. And if later you decide, no, I want to be a doctor, too late. The government pays for everyone's education, and the government won't pay for you to switch your career path. You're stuck. And Carl Sandburg, a poet, says, when a nation goes down, one condition always be found. They forgot where they came from. So this tearing down of history is not just a recent phenomenon. 3rd century BC, China had the Warring States period, where half a dozen Chinese kingdoms were fighting. One, it was Qin Shi Huangdi, and he was the founder of the Han Dynasty. He was criticized for doing things differently than they had been done before. And so he decided to destroy all the records of how things were done before. So he ordered all of the classics of history, all their ancient history, books destroyed. Now they weren't books, they were bamboo scrolls. So they had strips of bamboo that they would sort of weave together, and they would write their characters top to bottom, right? But they were bamboo annal type books. And so Qin Shi Huangdi ordered them burned. And his chancellor, Li Si, wrote in 213 BC, I, servant, propose all historians' records other than those of Qin's be burned. If anyone under heaven has copies of the classics of history, they shall deliver them to the governor for burning. Anyone who dares discuss the classics of history shall be publicly executed. Anyone who uses history to criticize the present shall have his family executed. Anyone who failed to burn the books after 30 days of this announcement shall be sent to build the Great Wall. Right? And so here, not just tearing down American history, here the Chinese, and then that inspired Mao Zedong in the 1960s. He had a revolution, but not just, it was a cultural revolution. So he destroyed the oldest Buddhist temple in China, the Great Gates of Beijing. He destroyed thousands of years of Chinese culture. Why? Because he wanted to cut ties with the past, have a bunch of millions of kids that have no clue where they came from, and then brainwash them into the People's Republic of China. And then the current leader in China, Xi Jinping, ordering erasure of Genghis Khan from Chinese history. Here, Mongolia had a leader named Genghis Khan, right? And then his grandson Kublai Khan, and they were significant. They had the largest contiguous empire in world history. And here, they're still wanting to change the history. And then Pol Pot did the same thing in Cambodia. And he he made 1975 the New Year zero, and that anything prior to that was irrelevant, and he killed anybody that wore glasses. He said if you wore glasses, you could read. If you read, you knew the history, and he wanted to separate from the history. And Islam does this. Whenever Muslims come into a country, they destroy history. When they came into Cairo, Egypt, they destroyed the library in Alexandria. Supposedly took 6 months to burn all the books. Anyway, so we're seeing this today with the 619 Project and Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. It's all the founders were bad, and the kids get repulsed by them, and they're in the neutral, then you brainwash them into your socialist future. Well, the French Revolution did this. They tore down the statue of good King Henry IV, and then they wanted to destroy religious monuments, and desecrate graves, and religious meetings were prohibited, churches were closed, Christian schools were banned, church education outlawed, no public worship was allowed. They killed whole orders of nuns. And so here's the picture of them. And these nuns were like singing their church song, and there'd be one less voice singing, and one less voice singing, and one less, until there's the last one, they chopped their head off. And cross were forbidden, and anyway. The similar thing happened in Mexico under President Calles in 1917. Then they killed 300,000 in a rural farming area called the Vendee. They thought, we're hundreds of miles away from the capital, we're safe. They send their army out there, and they consider the first modern genocide. And Robespierre puts a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covers her with sheep, so this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. And they don't want done in the year of the Lord. So they made 1792 the New Year 1. And they didn't like a 7-day week because it went to the Bible, so they came up with a 10-day week. And each day had 10 hours, and each hour had 100 minutes, each minute had 100 seconds. They said 10 was the number of man because you count with 10 fingers. And so they made every measurement in France divisible by 10. They called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system. And anyway, since there is no God anymore, who decides what's right and wrong? The mob, the state, the fraternity, and so out of that unstructured chaos comes a tyrant, a dictator, Napoleon. That's a democracy without morals and virtues and chaos out of which the tyrant. So Napoleon takes the crown and puts it on his own head and kills 6 million people across Europe in his wars. And so afterwards, Napoleon's banished to the island of Elba, and the German king, Frederick, says, we can't get conquered that easy again. We need to strengthen our state. So he got a philosopher named Hegel, who was at the University of Berlin, and he came up with a way of strengthening state. And we see a transition. So follow me here. We go from the Pilgrim Covenant, where you're committed to each other because you're personally accountable to God, and you get rights from God. In the century after the Pilgrims, covenant turned into social contract with the Age of Enlightenment. And it's just people in agreement with each other. You're not committed to each other, you're just agreeing with stuff. And you get your rights from the group, you're accountable to the group. If God is there, he's distant. He's uninvolved. This comes from scientific revolution, where Isaac Newton discovered laws of gravity, laws of planetary motion, laws of optics, and some theologian says, well, maybe God made everything with laws. And like a guy winds up a clock and all the gears run, maybe God just sort of stepped back and everything's just sort of running on its own. The ultimate of this is God is an impersonal force in the universe. And so we go from Pilgrim covenant to Age of Enlightenment social contract with a distant God, to the French Revolution, which was social contract with no God, to Marxism and socialism, where the state is God. Did you catch that? So we go through these 4 steps. I have it. We have covenant with a personal God, social contract with an impersonal, distant God, social contract with no God, and Marxism and socialism, where the state is God. So Hegel, University of Berlin, says the state is God walking on earth. We must worship the state. All the worth which the human being possesses, he possesses only through the state. Rousseau, who wrote the social contract, says, once the state says to a citizen, it is expedient for the state that you should die. He ought to die, because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. And this went into their thinking in Germany so much that a century later, the National Socialist Workers' Party, which is what Nazi stands for, had this. The New York Times reported, Nazi Ministry of Justice authorized physicians to end the sufferings of incurable patients. No life still valuable to the state will be wantonly destroyed. The state decides the worth of your life. And of course this influenced Pol Pot in Cambodia, where he said to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss. So he killed 3 million people. And so we go through this step. And Hegel says the state recognizes no authority but its own. It acknowledges no abstract rules of good and bad. What's an abstract rule of good and bad? You mean the 10 Commandments? Yeah, there's no God. There's no abstract rules. It's just a power grab by the state. And if you help the state grab more power, the state thinks your life is worth something to it. If you don't help the state get more power, then the state views you as a threat and it will use the power of the state to kill you. And Eisenhower said this, in many lands, the state claims to be the author of human rights. If the state gives rights, it can and inevitably will take away those rights. The Founding Fathers had to refer to the Creator in order to make their revolutionary experiment make sense. It was because all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights that men could dare to be free. In other words, do your rights come from the government or from a source higher than government? Our founders went above the king's head. We get rights from a Creator, and the government's job is to protect our Creator-given rights. Well, if there is no Creator, your rights come from the government. What the government giveth, the government can taketh awayeth. And now, I talked about democracy without morals and virtue ends in chaos, out of which a tyrant arises. Some political people said, well, you know what? Let's speed it along by intentionally creating crisis. And so this gave birth to a whole bunch of people, and the Bible says how good and pleasant it is for people to dwell together in unity. And the other side of it is Proverbs 6 things the Lord hates: proud look, lying tongue, hand swift to shedding innocent blood, he that soweth discord. So we got God liking unity, and here we have God hating those that sow discord. And so a biblical example is Israel, right? So they were a republic for 400 years, and one of the period they had Gideon, and he defeated the Midianites. Well, he has an illegitimate son named Abimelech. So Gideon's illegitimate son. He sows discord to end this Hebrew republic. He goes to the town of Shechem, and he says, is it better for you that the son of Gideon reign over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. He is the first one to do identity politics, race politics, right? Doesn't matter whether Gideon's sons are doing a good job or a bad job. I'm one of you. And so his brethren spake of him in the ears of the men of Shechem with these words, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. And so there's no enemy attacking Israel at this time. It's just him sowing this discord. And so he takes money from the treasury of the temple and hires protesters and rioters to commit violence. Could you imagine paying people to commit violence? It says they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, wherewith Abimelech hired vain and worthless persons rioters which followed him, and he went to his father's house over and slew his brethren. So here you basically pay a bunch of people with no morals to commit violence. And so then he became king, and then a couple years later he killed all the people in Shechem anyway. And so another story, Italy. We're talking about democracy without morals and virtue ends in chaos, out of which the tyrant usurps power, and some people want to speed it along, and one is Machiavelli. He lived 500 years ago in Italy. Italy was a bunch of city-states: Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena, and they all had armies and fought. And Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end, because it'll stop the infighting, that any means necessary to get there is justified. So if a prince conquers a city, the people would hate him. But if the prince pays criminals to kill cows, burn barns, smash windows, set buildings on fire, the people will panic and cry out for help. The prince will come in and get rid of the very people he bribed to start the crises. Nobody will know the better for it, and everyone will praise the prince as a hero. So it's good marketing. You go around the back of the house and set it on fire, and then you come around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher. And they'll pay anything for it, and even thank you for being there. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. Right? You want to speed along the crises, and you know this phrase better as a more recently worded, you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. It's an opportunity to do those things you think you could not do before. Rahm Emanuel. And then Hillary Clinton. The chief of staff of President Obama, an old friend of mine and my husband, said, you know, never waste a good crisis. So when you and I see a crisis, our response is how can we help people through it? They see a crisis, and their response is how can I use this to usurp power? And so they want to create a crisis or take advantage of it. So this idea of Abimelech, this idea of Machiavelli, this Hegel guy turned it into a triangle. You know how Germans like to be really analytical, and so it's a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Sounds complicated, but it's not. You start off with the status quo, and you create a problem that is real bad. And then everybody's happy to settle for your answer. That's half as bad. That becomes the new starting point, and you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer. That's half as bad. Then you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer. It's half as bad. And after each crisis, the people surrender a little bit more of their freedom and their independence to the state. And so it goes from the people ruling themselves bottom up to the dictator deep state ruling from the top down. And so guess who was a student at the University of Berlin under Hegel? Karl Marx. He was a member of the radical student group called the Young Hegelians. And Karl Marx says, well, how do you create an antithesis that's real bad? You send in agitators, agent provocateurs, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job is to find people with grievances, stir them up to riot, and when the country gets disorganized enough and panics, then the people will want somebody to come in, and the leader usurps power. And at first he all smiles, and then he stands in the chariot of the state holding the reins of power. He's revealed as the tyrant. And so he would organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, the poor against the rich, blacks against the whites, Catholics against the Protestants, Muslims against the Christians, Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo and Rwanda. They really don't care who the two sides are, and they really don't care what the issues are. Their goal is a destabilizing crisis that's so bad everybody knee-jerk reaction, panics, and says, we want the government to come in and restore order, and when they do, the form of government switches from bottom up to top down. And so how did socialism come to America? Well, there was Eugene Debs, and he comes to Chicago, where they make railroad cars, the Pullman Railroad Car Company. And they had a nice little village where the workers lived, and the nice little stores where the workers shopped, and then the factories where they worked. And it was nice, and but then orders for railroad cars dropped off, and the people were having grievances. And so Eugene Debs comes over and organizes the people with grievances to riot. And it spreads to 27 states and destroys $80 million worth of railroad cars. All across America, the whole country is brought to a standstill. And finally, Grover Cleveland, the president, sends in the U.S. Army. And then Eugene Debs founds the Socialist Party of America. and he runs for president 5 times between 1900 and 1920. One time he ran from prison, and then in 1920, the Socialist Party of America splits off the Communist Party USA, and they ran candidates for president every year from 1920 to 1940, until what happened in 1940? You had Franklin Roosevelt make a treaty with Stalin during World War II. So the Communist Party USA says, why should we run our own candidate? From now on, they supported Democrat candidates. And now we go to Germany. 1920s and 30s, Germany was a republic. The people were involved, ruling themselves, bottom-up republic. And somebody started a political party. It was Hitler's National Socialist Workers' Party, or Nazi. And he had a violent arm to his party, sort of like an Antifa BLM arm. And they were called brown shirts, or Sturmabteilung, which means stormtroopers. They would storm into the meetings of Hitler's opponents and shout down the speakers, disrupt the meeting. And then they would lock arms and block access to buildings and block streets. Could you imagine people blocking arms and blocking things? And then they went into the cities and they smashed windows and looted and set on fire over 7,000 Jewish stores in the night of broken glass, Kristallnacht. And then the Capitol got set on fire. And this is Hitler's brown shirts that are behind this stuff. And when the country gets panicky enough, a knee-jerk reaction, they want someone to come in and restore order. Hitler usurps power, declares himself Führer, rounds up his political enemies, has them shot without trial. And then once he's in power, he decides to kill off the brown shirts, right? The former revolutionaries. They didn't need them anymore. And so we see this model beginning to become clearer as we get to the present. So World War II ends, and Germany, France, and England give up their former colonies, and they become brand new countries with brand new leaders. They're climbing out of the post-war crisis, and it's a promising world until the Soviet Union decides that it doesn't just want communism to run the Soviet Union, they want it to rule the world. And so they would send KGB agents into these brand new countries and find people with grievances. Racial grievances, economic grievances, ethnic grievances, Bosnian Serbs, Croats, religious grievances, Orthodox, Sunni, Shia. They didn't really care, and they would organize them into haves and have-nots, victims and oppressors. And then they would organize protests that they would escalate into riots and then violence. And then they would co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the new leader of the brand new country for all the problems. And then they would cultivate weak links in the military. And when the country got panicky and confused enough, they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. They would even do, they would release false polling data prior to a rigged election, showing the popular leader is unpopular, so when they did the coup, people wouldn't fight it. And so it was called this psychological operation. And so these are the countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Poland, 45 countries fell to communist leaders this way. And it's called the countries behind the Iron Curtain. Here's a quote from, so Truman does nothing. Here he is, Truman's the president. He thinks the United Nations that he helped form will bring world peace. And the next president is Eisenhower. Eisenhower says the United Nations seems to be two distinct things to the two worlds divided by the Iron Curtain. To the free world, it seems that it should be a constructive forum. To the communist world, it has been a sounding board for their propaganda, a weapon to be exploited for the spreading of disunity and confusion. So Eisenhower has a choice. Do nothing and let all these countries fall to communists, or counter them by fighting fire with fire. And so we have a situation, 1953. Iran decides to side with the Soviet Union, and it nationalizes their oil industry. And you think, big deal. Well, wait a second, Britain has no oil, right? I mean, they have one oil well in the Sherwood Forest. I mean, and so when Winston Churchill changed the British Navy from coal to oil, and they have this global navy. And so in 1908, Britain formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, right? Well, you know better as BP. So BP, British Petroleum, is the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And when Mossadegh, the leader of Iran in 1953, decided to side with the Soviet Union and nationalize it, Britain effectively has no oil. And so the British go to Eisenhower for help, and Eisenhower approves the first CIA operation to overthrow a country's leader. It's Operation Ajax, and they send in Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. He's an expert at foreign languages. He goes over to Tehran, and he recruits mobsters and gangsters and radical imams, and they stage protests and riots and attack mosques. And they co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame Mossadegh for all of the problems, and they cultivate weak links in the military, and when the country gets panicky and confused enough, they go in and put Mossadegh under house arrest. And they lock him away for the rest of his life where he dies, and they replace him with the Shah. And the Shah loved America because we put him in. And the CIA did the same thing in Guatemala in 1954, in Congo, Dominican Republic, Brazil, even Chile in 1973, and the KGB did the same thing. With Brezhnev helping Yasser Arafat to start the PLO, and Brezhnev hugging Castro and helping take over Cuba and countries in Latin South America, and they had hundreds of coup attempts in Africa, and the Chinese did the same thing in the Far East. This is called the Cold War. It's the subject of every spy novel. You go to a third world country, you run into the Russians, the KGB, and you run into the CIA, and they're all going to do an assassination. The only difference is this time around, it seems to be taking place on our own soil. Here's an interesting quote. Chris Matthews, his last interview on TV. It's after a Democrat candidate debate where some of the candidates are talking about being socialist, and he says this: I remember the Cold War. I have seen what socialism is like, and I don't like it, okay? It's not only not free, it doesn't work. I believe that if Castro and the Reds had won, there would have been executions in Central Park. And right after that, Chris Matthews was canned. And so we're talking about Castro and killings, executions. Castro's killer was Che Guevara. And Che Guevara wrote, "We executed many people by firing squad without knowing if they were fully guilty. I'd like to confess, I discovered that I really like killing. Blind hate," this is Che Guevara, "blind hate against the enemy creates a forceful impulse that cracks the boundaries of natural human limitations, transforming the soldier into an effective, selective, cold killing machine, and people without hate cannot triumph." Right? This is obviously different than the gospel of Jesus Christ, where God tells us to love and forgive. So, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. And they also wrote this, that they were alchemists of the revolution. Their business consists in spurring it into artificial crises. Every new crisis must be more serious and more universal than the last. Every fresh slump must ruin more small capitalists. This will increase the number of the unemployed, and in the end, a commercial crisis will lead to a social revolution. So here, to establish a socially structured society of a ruling class and a ruled class, you have to get rid of the middle class. Lenin said you grind them between millstones of taxation and inflation. Lenin killed all the kulaks, who were the successful middle-class farmers. So he killed them all. He said, don't just kill them, hang them in the streets, and P.S., get stronger men. And so he kills all these kulak middle-class farmers in 1921. Well, guess what? There were no farmers to farm the crops. And so in 1922, millions of Russians died of starvation. Duh. Didn't see that coming. And here's a Chicago Tribune article. It says, spend, spend, spend under the guise of recovery, bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failure, junk the Constitution, declare a dictatorship. So this spend, spend, spend is what they call the Great Reset. So they're wanting not just America to continue to spend bailout money that we don't have, but it's every country in the world spending bailout money. And when they have a few more of these lockdown crises and bailouts, then all the governments are going to go bankrupt. And when they go bankrupt and belly up, that's when they're going to jump to their Constitution and institute a new, the goal is to a new cryptocurrency that they control, and you won't be able to buy or sell without it, and so forth. So historically, whoever's president when there's an economic collapse gets voted out, like Herbert Hoover. And so you look at a lot of timing of what's recently happened, and here you have COVID. 99% of the people recover from it. And under 18, almost nobody gets it. And there are a whole lot of alternative type cures that you can research and so forth that for some reason are being censored. And but the net result of the COVID was to shut things down. and have a economic impact that is devastating. And David Horowitz was a former communist, and then he became a conservative writer. Says the communist attitude is the issue is never the issue is always the revolution. Civil rights, women's rights is never the real cause. Women and blacks are only instrument in the larger cause, which is power. Battles over rights and other issues, according to Alinsky, should never be seen as more than occasions to advance the real agenda, which is the accumulation of power. So people say, oh, it's, this matters and that matters and all this and that. He says, the goal is to have a destabilizing crisis. And then when it gets bad enough, everybody will be willing to give up their freedoms to the government who promises to restore order. And those that are involved in the rioting, I talked to a policeman today that came over as a Des Moines policeman, and he says that during the rioting in Des Moines, they had arrested some guy, and he was like dressed as, some medieval knight with a wood shield, and and he says he felt sorry for the guy because after they arrested him, he didn't even know why he was there. He's like, and so Lenin called the people that are involved in these rioting useful idiots. They serve a purpose, but their goal is to just bring about a destabilizing crisis. And then it gets interesting. The communists would do this, and we knew about it. But here in 1980, is one of the communist agents defected and actually snitched on what they do. His name's Yuri Bezmenov, and he said that the KGB, people think of him as James Bond. He goes, no, because our job was to go into a country and identify the public opinion molders in the media, education, and the pulpit, and pull them in a socialist direction, a woke type of direction. And so this is the idea, they couldn't defeat America during the World War II on two fronts. I mean, we were like so powerful, so their goal was to rot us from within. Like you climb a tree, you put your foot on a branch, it's nice and solid, but if it's branch is rotten and it breaks off. And so their idea is a long-term plan to rot America morally from the inside. And so he says there's the demoralization. It takes 20 years where you infiltrate the schools, the media, and the pulpit, and you push a socialist message. Then he said there's a 5-year period called destabilize where you get the country to bankrupt itself by irresponsible spending. And then he says there's a 6-month period of some crisis you blow up and cause a national panic, and then you do your coup. And so the infiltrating of the church I thought was interesting. So Albert Herlong, a congressman, read the communist goals into the congressional record in 1963. One of them was infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion, social justice. And there was a black man, Manny Johnson. He became a communist in the 1930s for 10 years. He even ran for Congress in New York as a communist. And then he realized they really didn't want to help his people, and so he left. He testified before the U.S. Congress, and he wrote a book that Archibald Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt, wrote the foreword to. And he talked about how the communists wanted to infiltrate churches. And he says the first goal is they wanted to get rid of the Bible and get rid of God, like they did in Russia, making them spit on the Bible and stomp on it. But he says that the minorities in America were too attached to the Bible, so their goal was to twist the gospel. And he said the new line went like this: Jesus, the carpenter, was a worker like the communists. He was against the money changers, the capitalists, the exploiters of the day. This is why he drove them from the temple. Communists are the modern day fighters against the capitalists or money changers. If Jesus were living today, he'd be a communist, right? Forget the fact that we're all sinners bound for hell, and God in his love and mercy sent his only begotten son Jesus to die on the cross to pay for all of our sins. Forget all that. They just make Jesus into a Palestinian activist, right? And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who spent 11 years in the Soviet prison gulags, labor camps, he says, I call upon America to be more careful with its trust. Prevent those from falsely using the struggle for social justice to lead you down a false road. Jesus didn't say, go out and smash windows and loot and kill to show everybody I love them. Right? And then you have Saul Alinsky. And he was in Chicago, and he rode around with Al Capone's hitman, Frank Nitti. And so how all Al Capone's men had to do was kill a few people and smash a few windows, and the whole neighborhood would panic and surrender and agree to pay the mob protection money. And so Saul Alinsky applied this to politics. And he says that the first step in community organizing is community disorganizing. Disruption of the present organization is the first step. The organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. It's like Abimelech going into Shechem. The organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent, fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. The organizer polarizes the issue, helps lead his forces into conflict. He must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. This has been the politics that we've experienced in America for an entire generation. The intentional stirring up of racial tensions, economic tensions, class tensions, and all this. And now Saul Alinsky has this acknowledgement in the front of his book. Lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. The strategy that he implemented, he credits Lucifer. And what's he talking about? It's Proverbs 6. 6 things the Lord hates. And the last one is he that soweth discord amongst the brethren. The sowing of discord. And they use a technique called blame shifting, where the attacker blames the victim. And little kids do this. I didn't start the fight, you started it. Right? Muslim men will rape a woman and blame her. It's your fault for tempting me. Right? So the attacker blames the victim. And so in politics, it's turned around where a candidate will accuse his opponent of exactly the crimes they're guilty of. Right? So they'll call you intolerant and hateful when really they're the intolerant and hateful ones. They project their negative qualities onto you. And so they're doing all these different crisis type things all across the country. And we look at the COVID response. What was it? Well, the first thing was letting criminals out of jail. And then crime goes up. Duh, didn't think that would happen. And then some people move out of the big cities because of the crime. Well, who moves out? Well, maybe those with families. And so pro-family people move out. Who's left in the cities? Well, maybe those that are dependent on government entitlements. Well, the pro-family people, they usually belong to one political party, and those dependent on government entitlements usually belong to another political party. And then businesses are closed and looted and vandalized, and so pro-business people move out of the city. Okay, they tend to belong to that one political party. And then churches are shut down where pro-life social conservatives organize. And then schools are closed, letting these kids that have been indoctrinated with hate America to be available to riot. Net result of the COVID response was more people of one political party move out of the big cities, leaving the other party in monopoly control of city politics. If they're going to do voter fraud, there's going to be fewer people in the other party to even be there to watch. And in election years, whoever wins the big cities wins the state. Whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes for the state, and the president is elected by electoral votes. So you have a clear political advantage to one party for the COVID response, right? You have violence go up, people from another political party move out. Shut down businesses, they move out. Shut down churches, they move out. Who's left? They get a monopoly control. They win the big city, they win the state, get all the electoral votes. The president's elected by electoral votes. And so I just thought I'd come and give you a little encouragement tonight, you know. Now, for most of world history, the world's been ruled top down by tyrants. And you go through from Nimrod, Tower of Babel, and Gilgamesh, Sargon of Acadia, pharaohs, Chinese emperors, you know, Cyrus of Persia, Alexander the Great. Sometimes you have a good one, sometimes you have a bad one, but the problem is you get a good one and they want to concentrate power so they can do good more efficiently, but then they're not in power forever and they end up handing it over to some kid, some grandson that's a corrupt person who uses that concentrated power to oppress people. Right? Remember Joseph in Egypt helped concentrate power into the hands of Pharaoh? What did the Pharaoh do with that concentrated power? He fed the children of Israel, gave them the best land of Goshen, even gave jobs taking care of his cattle. But then there was a new Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. And he used all that concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel, even making them throw their kids in the Nile River. Right? So that's the dilemma. That you know, the bad kings want to concentrate power so they can oppress people. Every now and then you get a good one, but he wants to concentrate power so he can do good more efficiently, but then he hands it over to some grandson that ends up using it oppressively. So that's why God took the Tower of Babel and scattered it. But it's like every generation since tries to rebuild the Tower of Babel. And these empires keep getting bigger and bigger because with military advancements you can kill more people. And so finally, you know, we have what made America unique. We had this polarity change. Instead of top-down, ruled by kings and pharaohs and sultans, it's bottom up, ruled by we. We the people. The difference between a dead pyramid and a living tree where every root and every little capillary root sucks in nutrients, they'll keep the tree alive. Every citizen participates in this bottom-up form of government. So who's the king in America? Signer of the Constitution, Gouverneur Morris, said the magistrate is not the king, the people are the king. Chief Justice John Jay said the people are the sovereign of this country. Signer of the Constitution, James Wilson, sovereignty resides in the people. They've not parted with it. Abraham Lincoln, the people of these United States are the rightful masters of both Congresses and courts. Grover Cleveland, the sovereignty of 60 million to free peoples, the working out of the divine right of man to govern himself, a manifestation of God's plan concerning the human race. So what makes America great is basically you get to be the king of your life and decide where you want to live, who you want to marry, what job you want to pursue, what church you want to go to or not go to. You get to make those, and then all of us together are the kings of America. So who's the king of America? We are. And the word citizen is Greek. It means co-ruler or co-king. You're a citizen of America, you're a co-king of America. James Wilson, signer of the Constitution, every citizen forms a part of the sovereign power he possesses a vote. Not to vote is to abdicate the throne. Well, what about Romans 13? Every person is subject to the governing authorities. Well, who's the ultimate governing authority in America? It's we, the people. And so imagine visiting a king in the Old Testament, and you're going through the streets of Jerusalem, and you're witnessing murder, rape, and crime, and you get into the king's chamber. And he's all worried, and he looks up at you, and he says, did you see all that crime coming in here? I wish someone would fix it. You like tap the king on the shoulder and say, you're the king. This is your kingdom. I think you're the one accountable to God to fix it. That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the terrible stuff going on, saying, I wish somebody would fix this. Well, have a finger come out on the screen and tap you on the shoulder. You're the king. You're the one accountable to God to fix it. Well, I need somebody to tell me what to do. Since when does the king sit on his throne and say, can somebody tell me what I'm supposed to do? Hey, butler, come here. What am I supposed to do? No, it's your job to get educated on the issues and seek God's will, and you tell your representative what needs to happen. You're the king. God will give you ideas on what you can do. And Chief Justice John Jay said, Americans are the first people whom heaven has favored with an opportunity of choosing the forms of government under which they should live. Your lives, your liberty, your property will be at the disposal only of your Creator and yourselves. If I were to say what makes America great, it's this quote right here. Your lives, your liberty, and your property are at the disposal of you and God. You and God, you get to decide what you want to do with your life. Who you want to marry, what clothes you want to wear instead of burqas, what food you want to eat. And Reagan put it this way, in this country of ours took place the greatest revolution that has ever taken place in the world's history. Every other revolution simply exchanged one set of rulers for another. Here, for the first time in all the thousands of years of man's relation to man, the Founding Fathers established the idea that you and I had within ourselves the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. Right? So God gives you the freedom. In Egypt, Christians are called garbage people in Cairo because they're not allowed to hold a job higher than a Muslim, so they may spend their day digging through garbage to eke out a living. The system doesn't allow them. In India, they have the caste system. It's still culturally observed. And there's 7 major castes that you're born into. The highest is the Brahmin. They're near divinity in the Hindu belief system, and they're treated extra special. And the lowest is the Dalits, or untouchables. And their job is to clean the sewers. And even if they do a good job, they can never graduate. If their system does not allow you to do, you're limited. In atheistic countries, your worth is dependent on your utility. If you are useful to the state and the government thinks you're worth more. And if you're not, the government's happy to get rid of you. In America, you're worth something because you're made in the image of God. Yeah. Not because you can do anything. It's just the fact that you are made. You're made in the image of God, and we're all equal. And we pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic. What's a republic? A republic is where the people are king, ruling through representatives. And so we pledge allegiance to the flag. We're basically pledging allegiance to us being in charge of ourselves. So when somebody protests the flag, what they're saying is, I don't want to be the king anymore. I protest this system where I participate in being the king and ruling myself. Now the word politics comes from the Greek word polis, which means city. Politics, polis, and like Indianapolis and Minneapolis and metropolis, polis means city. So politics is simply the business of the city. And so in America, you get to be the king of your life and a co-king of the country, and you have the opportunity of willingly submitting your life to Jesus, the King of Kings.
Amen. Amen.
And it says, thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. So I talked this morning about conscience and William Penn and so forth. And so God is really interested in your free will. And so you have the choice of surrendering your life to him. And it says Jesus has made us kings and priests unto God and his Father. And so we can cast our crowns at his feet, right? And then if the people are the king, who are the counselors to the king? In 379 AD, there's a Roman emperor named Theodosius, and he's Christian by now. And his pastor is Bishop Ambrose in Milan, Italy. Could you imagine what it would be like being Ambrose and having the emperor in your church on Sunday? Well, that's sort of what we have in America. In America, the majority of the people are Christian. So back in 1965, it was 69% Protestant, 24% Catholic, 3% Jewish, so 96% of the country believed in some part of the Bible. And it's been going down, but we're down to 65% Christians, but it's still a majority. So if the people are the king and the majority of the people are Christian, if you saw the movie The Lord of the Rings, there's a very good scene of a king with a spell cast on him. He's got gray hair, gray eyes, he's just decrepit, cataracts, and he has two counselors. One is this greasy counselor named Wormtongue, who's whispering in the king's ear, saying, stay asleep, don't get involved, just keep sleeping. Yeah, your kingdom's been overrun, but just wait a little longer, it's all going to be over anyway. And then there's another counselor to the king named Gandalf. And he casts the devil out of the king, and right before your eyes, the king starts to look around, and he says, dark have been my dreams of late. Like, yeah, you've been out of it with a spell cast on you. And he says, maybe you'll remember your strength if you take your sword. And so in America, the people are the king. And the majority of the people are Christian. And they've had a spell cast on them where they've been taught, don't get involved, just sit back, just let whatever happens, happens. And then you have some pastors come along that wake up the king. Right? That's why I love your pastor so much. Pastor Dennis St. Lawrence. And so the king is in the pews. And the pastor's job is to tell the congregation, you don't just have the right to vote, you're going to be held accountable to God for what happens. Yeah. Right? If they're killing little babies or teaching little kids that there's, Jesus was the one who said, in the beginning God made them male and female. And so the most important thing is to bring people to Christ. But the second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. You will say, well, I'm just going to worry about bringing people to Christ. Well, unless you're involved in wanting to preserve the freedom to preach the gospel, you really don't believe the gospel. I'm just super spiritual, I'm just going to preach the gospel. Well, guess what? If you sit back long enough, it'll be like, Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, where's the death penalty to preach the gospel? Or in China or Hong Kong, where the government is arresting anybody that preaches, or North Korea, where you're put in a labor camp the rest of your life if you're caught preaching the gospel. Or the first open lesbian mayor of Houston decided to censor all the sermons of all the pastors in Houston. If there was some bill that came up that had to do with all the sexual thing, and she didn't want them to speak out against, so she wanted to censor all the sermons of all the pastors, right? And so here we have this movement in America that wants to take away the freedom to preach the gospel, and for you to say what's sin, what's not sin. And so if you're really convinced the gospel is the answer, you're going to be involved. And so the last thought is this. Every generation has had a crisis. We get through this crisis, there'll be another one. We get through that one, there'll be another one. You read all of 6,000 years, there's bubonic plague, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan. There's all these crises, and the crisis is an opportunity for people to respond. Now, most people don't come to Christ when everything's perfect in their life. There's some crises that's bigger than they are, and they say, help. Right? I mean, even with prayer, how many of us tend to pray more when everything's fine or when things are not fine? And all a nation is a bunch of individuals. And so it's in times of crisis that people turn to Christ, but it's also in times of crisis that God raises up leaders. And so so in whatever period of time that you would live in, you could be part of the problem, ignore the problem, or be part of the answer. Wanting to minister God's love to a hurting and dying world, or standing up for righteousness, or defending the defenseless. This is just our turn. I was thinking of freshman chemistry class where you have a beaker with a solution, and you pour in a catalyst that causes a reaction. And some stuff precipitates and gets heavy and falls to the bottom. And other stuff turns into little bubbles and floats to the top. The era that you live in is the solution, and the crises of the era is the catalyst. All the catalyst does is reveal what you're made of. Are you going to be part of the problem, ignore the problem, or are you going to rise above it and be part of the answer? And minister God's love and try to stand up for righteousness. And so it's sort of a self-sorting out of the sheep and the goats. It's not the ultimate sorting out of the sheep and the goats, but the crisis reveals what side you're on. Are you going to not do anything? So I just wait, or are you going to get out there and try to let God minister his will through you to a lost and dying world? I love the part about Abraham, and God knew what was in Abraham's heart. But he wanted to see Abraham take his son Isaac to the top of Mount Moriah and be willing to kill him. People say, God knows what's in my heart. Yeah, but he wants to see something. So it's like a man, he's watching TV, and you come up to him and you say, hey, when was the last time you told your wife you love her? I can't remember, but she knows my heart. It's like, okay. When was the last time you did anything to show your wife you love her? I can't remember, but she knows my heart. It's like, dude, we need to have a little talk. It's like, God knows my heart. Yes, he does know your heart, but he wants to hear some words out of your mouth, and he wants to see some actions.
Right.
Right? So you witness with your life, not just die and say, oh, no. And so so the crisis is just the opportunity for us to respond. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And anyway, so someday you're going to be dead. It's a nice way to end the talk. And you're going to be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise, the moment we just begun. Imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years. You're walking the streets of gold. You meet Moses. Maybe Moses will invite you over to his place. I don't know what it's like in heaven, but Jesus did say, in my Father's house are many mansions. I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. He'll probably have one of those fireplaces where the logs don't burn up. Get at the burning bush in the wilderness, didn't burn up, and the logs in the fireplace. I heard one preacher say, in heaven you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife would say, where is this? I was thinking about something else. But imagine being there in Moses' living room. Maybe he's got a big living room like here tonight. And after the small talk's over, you reach over, you tap him on the shoulder and say, Moses, tell us the story again. I read the book, I even saw the movie. But here you are in person. The room will get quiet, Moses will stand up and he says, I was 80 years old. And Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, was charging in at us. We were totally unarmed. And I stood there and held up my staff and I said, God, use me to deliver your people. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to see David. Say, hey, David, tell us your story. The room will get quiet. David will stand up. He goes, I was just a teenager. And this giant thug, Goliath, was mocking our God, making fun of our faith. And these grown-ups were too chicken and scared to do anything. And I said, well, enough of that. I took my little sling, went out there and hit him in the head, took his own sword and chopped his head off. And one by one, Gideon, Deborah, Apostle Paul, they're all going to tell their stories. It's going to be really exciting. And then everyone's going to look at you and say, you tell us your story. What did you do when it was your turn to be on earth? What were they saying about God in your country? What were they saying about the baby in the mother's womb or the marriage that God instituted in Genesis? What did you say when the whole world was against you and it looked hopeless? I'd hate for Jesus to walk in the room and have a big screen come down and show all kinds of miracles and crowds coming to the Lord and him saying, this is what I had planned for you to do, but you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look back at your life and you see that big mountain that held you back. It was just a little ant, this fear of, man, what are people going to think about me? And you say, I let that hold me back from doing all this great stuff. And you can't go back to earth and do anything else for the Lord because you're already in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have breath in our lungs. We still have feet that try the soil. You still can do those things you will be known for forever. And it's like a basketball game. And you're on the bench, and the coach comes over and slaps you on the back and says, it's your turn, get in the game. You're like, but coach, they're playing really tough out there. Yeah, I know, it's your turn, get in the game. But look, somebody just got knocked down. Yeah, I know, you're 7 feet tall, they're 4 feet tall. You can do this. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. Out of these 6,000 years, the good Lord decided for you to be alive right now. He's given you his word, he's given you his spirit, he's given you great pastors. He's given you all of this. And he thinks you got what it takes to do this. You can handle this. This is your time to shine for Jesus. Amen. So God bless you. Thank you so much.
Amen.